welcome to the TTS Talking Early Years podcast. Each week we'll be joined by educational experts from across the globe offering exclusive insights, inspiration and guidance to help practitioners unlock the potential of learning in the early years. Hello and welcome to the TTS Talking Early Years podcast, where each week we'll be joined by educational experts from across the globe who offer educational insights, inspiration and guidance that really help practitioners to unlock the potential for learning in the early years. My name is Alistair Bryce-Clegg and I'm your host for this week's TTS Talking Early Years podcast. I'm an early years consultant and author. Now, throughout this series, we've been discussing the importance of nurturing social and emotional well-being in the early years and really inspiring you with guidance and resources that can really help support your practice. And this week, I am delighted to introduce Samantha Dholakia as today's guest. So, hello, Sam, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. Thank you so much for having me join you today.
It's a pleasure. Now, before we get started, for anybody that hasn't heard of you and literally where have they been, can you just outline who you are, what you do, and how you come to be on today's podcast?
Absolutely. So, my goodness, who am I? This is like the burning question, isn't it? So, hi guys, I'm Sam. I used to be a teacher. I was an early years practitioner for a long time and then kind of moved around the school as you do with the many hats that you take on. And then I transitioned into the world of consultancy and teacher training. So I went up, started as a deputy, went into teacher training, and now I focus all of my being, other than my mummy being, on supporting teachers and parents when it comes to, or educators, anyone, big human or small, that works with behaviour, I guess, when it comes to supporting emotional regulation and understanding emotional intelligence and what place that has in the realm of education and behaviour. I'm a little bit passionate, so you might need to rein me in a little bit, Alistair, as we go through today. But my goal is to really kind of support adults and developed brains in understanding the difference between our minds and the little humans that we work with, so that we can not only really support them in the achievement in a sense of academia and what they can become in that part of their lives, but also in their social interactions as well. So I'm on a bit of a mission, Alistair, to be honest.
Well, brilliant. And I think the key is that, especially with adults that work in education, because I qualified nearly 35 years ago, and emotional regulation was never heard of or discussed. What was all about in the reception classroom was compliance.
Yes.
Children who didn't comply were then immediately othered as those children who don't behave. Or, I was in a setting the other day and just chatting to some girls as it happened in reception and about them settling in and how you're finding it and have you made some friends, and they're like, oh, but he's a naughty boy. And I thought, that's really interesting. We're hardly into the year. We've already got children who are defining other peers as being, in inverted commas, naughty. And I said, how do you know that he is a naughty boy? What does that mean? And again, we could probably discuss this at great length, but they said his peg was moved off the sun onto the sad cloud. So a little bit of public humiliation, behaviour management.
Yes. Yeah.
Which has already othered this poor boy into being the naughty boy. So I am pleased you're on a mission, because I'm going to join you on that mission.
Brilliant.
Equally passionate about the fact that a lot of the way we are taught to teach, or a lot of the way we are taught to manage children's behaviour, does not take into account emotional regulation or dysregulation. And I think also as practitioners, I was certainly taught to back myself into corners about saying, why do you think that Chloe is crying? Say sorry to Chloe, or if you don't do this, then this is not going to happen. When actually we're asking children who cognitively have not, or emotionally haven't developed those skills yet. So we put ourselves into compromise as a practitioner. But let's start off this first episode with just talking about that early development of emotional regulation, and also how impactful that early development is on how children then go on to foster that development later on.
Absolutely. Oh my goodness. It absolutely, I have to say, it does break my soul when I walk into a classroom and I see traffic lights on the wall, or, the sun and the clouds. It really does, because if we think about our young developing brains and the ideology that they are either good or bad, you know, and it really does kind of come back to that really simple sense of I'm either a really good child or I'm a really bad one, you know, and we reinforce that on a daily basis as practitioners when we do those whole kind of, as you said, that whole class approach to behaviour where we're thinking, right, okay, you're moving up or you're moving down, because that all becomes their identity, doesn't it? As you were saying.
And it's so public.
It's terrifying that, you know, 5, their identity is defined for them by a cloud.
If you're in a staff meeting and your head teacher's like, right, you two, like I used to be in staff meetings, stop chatting at the back or I'm going to move your peg. And then everybody who comes in, I'll say, well, Mr. Clegg's peg is on the very sad cloud. And when Ofsted come in, because also in this particular setting, there was a culture of the head teacher would come around, especially in the early days when children were having to learn to behave, and he would come and check the behaviour charts on a daily basis with an effort. I think the belief wasn't to harm or hurt children, the effort was to gain compliance. But also you've got children then who are not on the sun at the end of the day, who know it's the end of the day because it's tidy up time, but they also know that signifies their teacher's going to come in and check the chart. That level of deep-seated anxiety that's then being fed just also permeates into their whole attitude towards school, education, attachment, relationships, all of those things.
And beyond. You know, research has actually shown that high levels of internal stress or, you know, anxiety, anger, those big emotions actually impact us on a cellular level. You know, our immunity is compromised. So not only are we upsetting our children by doing things like that, but we're also making them sick, you know, or potentially making them sick, because actually they're not only hearing it and kind of engaging it in terms of environmentally, but it's an internal environment that we're creating. And I just think that when we start to look at behaviour, and it was interesting, you know, trying to teach children how to behave, that is exactly what we need to do. Rather than this blame, shame, guilt culture that I trained in myself, you know, this is how I was trained. I was right there with you, Alistair, you know, kind of having that training as an educator. What we actually want to do is teach the skills that are behaviour, rather than kind of the expectation. What is the appreciation? What is the understanding? What is it that we want our children to grow and develop and thrive within in order to do things like teamwork or share or, you know, those big challenges that we have as educators? Because ultimately all behaviour is coping mechanisms. It's all self-soothe. It's all regulation. You know, I think it's always quite interesting that we talk about, you know, self-regulation as breathing and as all of the, you know, the Instagrammable things, right? You know, there they are. But actually self-regulation is everything we do. We are constantly trying to self-regulate, but we're doing it from a place that hasn't been taught. So when we walk into a classroom and we see a chair being thrown, you know, thinking about those older ones, or the younger ones, you know, some of those, the chairs are pretty light in those classrooms, you know, or whatever it is. When we see those big behaviours, what we're seeing is self-regulation that hasn't been taught. It hasn't been channeled in a way that is purposeful and useful and feels good. What we're seeing is a raw self-regulation that actually we want to look at and observe and understand as practitioners. And I always think, you know, when it comes to those early years, thinking about what impact we have as practitioners, the underlying thing is all the impact. You know, in those first 5 years, our brain, the brain by the age of 5 is about 90% developed. So that is a very fast moving developmental stage. It's probably one of the fastest moving in our lifetime, in fact. So when we're thinking about the big behaviours in early years, of course they're there. You know, that brain is at 100 miles an hour.
They are, and I think what I often talk to practitioners about is the idea of, rather than managing behaviour, which you talk a lot about, is coaching behaviour. I know coaching can be a bit of like a coaching term, but when you've got children who are developing language, they're developing social interaction, they're developing levels of maturity, they're also still developing their brains, the parts of their brain that are not yet fully developed. You're going to have to show them, as you said, what it is to do this, what it is to apologize, what it is to negotiate, what it is to share. And even when you say, you know, I saw it again happen in practice where somebody said, now, he's got that toy and he would really like to play with it. So if you come back in a little while, then it can be your turn. And I could see this child thinking, what do you mean by a little while? What's a little while? What do you mean my turn? I don't want to take turns. I want that toy and I want it now. And that's when it results in a kick or a snatch or a thump or a bite. I think, again, often our response to that is, we don't kick here, we don't bite here. And true, we don't encourage that behaviour. But that isn't come from a place of like malicious evil where children are just going around trying to be horrible to each other. It comes from I've got an emotion, I don't know what it is, I can't process it, I haven't got the language to express it, so it comes out in my physicality and it's just an innate response. So help me to understand the response and coach me through how I could have done it differently, but don't expect just to do it once. You might have to do it 300 times because it's all about the development, not about me being willfully disobedient. I think when you shift your lens as a practitioner a bit, that really helps you to understand it more and approach it in a different way than rather than thinking you've been misbehaved and therefore I want you to behave. It's about, okay, I can see where you're at in terms of your development. Let me help you to articulate that better.
Absolutely. And I think, when we're thinking about particularly our early years, our young developing brain, that idea of a little while, that idea of taking turns, it all needs practice. I was talking to an educator in one of the schools that we're supporting at the moment, and they were saying, about the idea that the children just need to be able to do it. And whenever I hear this, and I hear it a lot, I'm sure you do too, I always think we wouldn't give our children in year 6 their SATs without teaching them the curriculum. There's a reason our curriculum goes round and round and round. We touch on it many times before they get to the end of primary and then before they get to the end of secondary. We go over things over and over again, but we don't go over things over and over again when it comes to behaviour and supporting children in understanding that. And we just expect them to get it straight away. Of course that child's not meant to kick. Why would they kick? And I think, truthfully honest, as adults, if we weren't taught it, we'd be kicking each other a lot of the time. I mean, I watched them behind the wheel of the car and I'm thinking, if you weren't in that car,
exactly.
the self-regulation off the chart there, right? So you kind of think, if our grown-ups are over 25, because the brain takes 25 years to fully develop, so past 25, when your brain is fully, completely developed and that's it, if they can't manage their emotions, but we're expecting our 5-year-olds to, it's kind of looking at that in a bigger picture, thinking, how does this fit? How do we support those children? How do we look at the young brain? And how do we support them in building the neurological pathways, that blueprint that they can take into adulthood, so that they're not that person behind the wheel, so they're not kind of having that emotional struggle internally at the age of 25 and above, because ultimately what we do in the early years is build the foundations. And I think we know that when it comes to maths, when it comes to literacy, when it comes to all these other things, but we don't necessarily recognize it when it comes to emotional regulation and behavior.
And I think for our earliest practitioners, part of this is also challenging some of the traditional rules and routines around being in the early years. So if you've got children who are kind of grouped and caged in activities, either with an adult or going to a specific place to do a specific thing, they have less opportunity for those opportunities to learn about emotional regulation to occur. The more in free play they are, and the more adults are in free play rather than being at a particular spot with a particular group of children, then the more chance there is that these things will happen, and the more chance adults have then to coach and to manage and do all of those things. So a lot of the things we do, carpet time, group time, although they've all got their place, we do an awful lot of it. It's a lot of children sitting in one space. There's a lot of having to share because you've all been asked to do the same activity with the same resources. And actually, if we freed all of that up and created spaces and activities that were a bit more linked to children's development as opposed to the curriculum, then actually what we do is foster a much more positive attitude towards developing self-regulation.
And a more internally driven one.
Yeah, absolutely. Loads of engagement.
intrinsic motivation is what we really want for our young people, whether they're 5 or 15. And if we can teach them that through an environment, and I think the environment has such a huge role to play, as you said, you know, having 30 children or more in some cases sat on a carpet, and that kind of approach where they have to, and I see it so much in schools, you know, they have to sit with their legs crossed and their arms folded. Developmentally, get my word out, in terms of their physical development, they actually they're not meant to sit in that way for any sustained time, you know. And the amount of times where I've done lesson observations and, you know, kind of supported teachers in the classrooms and seen them feel out of control because they don't think the children are quote unquote behaving in a way, you know, behaving well. But actually, if a child is sitting with their legs to the side and fiddling with something and looking out the window, we automatically assume that that's it, we've lost them. But actually, we all learn in different ways. And for some children, thinking about kind of, you know, particularly like sensory seeking, sensory input, some children need more sensory input than others. And if you have a child who is sensory, you know, getting sensory overwhelm, if they choose to then take a moment and just look out of the window while listening to you, whilst, you know, twiddling the carpet or what have you, that means they're managing their sensory input. It doesn't mean they're not listening. It means that they're not doing it in the way that we would assume they should. And I always say turn your shoulds into coulds, because actually every human does all of these in a very different way. And if we could just recognize that all you need to do is check in with that child and be like, you know, how did that feel for you? You know, what did you like about that? Did you get it? Did you understand it? What are you going to do next, sort of thing, minus all of those questions at once, of course. Then that's going to help that learning process, rather than, oh, you know, Sam, are you listening? Sam, we're waiting for you. You know, those kind of traditional teacher approaches that we're
stopping here for one rude boy, that kind of thing that we do.
That's it. Yeah, we're just going to sit here and stare at you until you're looking this way.
Exactly. I really hope that's coming to the fore, because I think the more that we're finding out about neurodivergence and the more we're finding out about the way that different children learn, as we do as adults, we need, though, to bring that into traditional practice. I did work with a reception class who had a no shoes in school policy, so they all took their shoes off when they came in, put their slippers on, or whatever they brought with them. And then the teacher said to them, right, come on, there's something I need to talk to you about, which was kind of like, let's do phonics. And they got bean bags, cushions, and they were sitting, lying, lolling on the carpet. She did a brilliant input session. They were all with her 100% of the way. Then they got up and went off and did their play and just put their things back. But again, I was thinking at the time that people I've observed with who would look at that and say, like, you can't have children lying on a bean bag. But actually their engagement was really high, whereas you're right, then children are concentrate on, is my back straight, especially the ones who are more compliant or feel the need to be compliant. Am I sitting upright? And all they're thinking about is, are my arms crossed? Am I going to get into trouble if I move? And
do I look like I'm listening? Am I following? Am I tracking the speaker? Are my eyes open enough? Does she see me?
Downloaded laminated things that do my head in, that say good listening looks like, and there's all these pictures of eyes and lips, and actually that's not what good listening looks like. You know, as an adult, if you're really engaged with something, you're not sitting up like this. You just, you know, you'll find yourself popping Maltesers in your mouth while you're listening. But all of those things, again, need to feed down into our classroom practice. So whether you're in a classroom or a nursery setting, even child-minded, whoever you are, I think one of the things you've got to do is just challenge that. What is my expectation? And is it about compliance, or is it actually about valuing the authenticity of how children learn, which is what we're all about? And on that note, I think that's a lovely questioning note to leave our first episode on, for us to reflect on our own practice and think about whether we are valuing children as unique individuals, and what could we challenge in that would really help them with their emotional regulation. So thanks, Sam. That has been fascinating and over too quickly. And if you're listening, don't forget to join us in the next episode, where we're going to be diving a little bit more into the concept of emotional intelligence and how it applies to the children in our setting. I'd just like to say a huge thank you to our guest, Sam, for joining us and providing such interesting and valuable insights. You've been listening to the TTS Talking Early Years podcast with me, Alistair Bryce-Clegg, and Sam Dholakia. And if you've been inspired by our conversation today, then don't forget you can sign up via the link in the episode notes to be the first to hear about future episodes and access exclusive follow-up content, including ideas for your setting and links to relevant resources.